Most modern baseball cards show us the game as it is. The photographs are vivid, colorful, each a moment in time captured forever, a truthful and often exciting account of how each player played a part in the unfolding drama of the game. This was not always the case. The further you go back into the early days of baseball cards and the game they depicted, the more you find a completely different approach with a completely different motivation. And for me, there's one pre-war card and one player that best represents this. What's up, everybody? Alex here with a freshly brewed cup of coffee. This is an ongoing series that uses vintage baseball cards to explore baseball history. So let's say you want to learn more about the early days of baseball, and you open up some books. Or you turn on some documentaries. Or maybe click on some YouTube videos like this one. Whatever resource you use, you'll inevitably come upon the name of Christy Mathewson, the legendary pitcher of the New York Giants who helped shape the game, define an era, and emerge a hero of a generation. And when you see the images of the man they called the gentleman's hurler, you may see him in his Sunday best for a photographic portrait. Or perhaps in his military uniform thanks to his service during World War I. But more often than not, you'll see Mathewson in his element. Gloriously dusty and dirty urban ballparks surrounded by his contemporaries, playing the game he mastered. So it's interesting, and maybe even a little puzzling, to come across this rendering of Mathewson on a pre-war baseball card. Not in a stadium covered in sweat and dirt, or in a black and white photographed portrait, but instead all on his own, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a vast, green, idyllic and sun-drenched field. What does this artwork from the dawn of the 20th century say about Mathewson, about baseball in America, and about ourselves as fans? And oh yeah, is this perhaps the most beautiful baseball card ever made? To find out, we'll head to Factoryville, Pennsylvania. A town named for the textile factory that was part of its founding, it's a community nestled within the picturesque hills and mountains in the northeastern part of the state, bordering New York. It's the kind of place where you don't have to look too far to be reminded of nature and of your connection to the land. Christopher Mathewson was born here on August 12, 1880, the son of a Civil War veteran who was a post office worker and a farmer. Mathewson was the oldest of 6, and as he grew up, everyone called him Husk, the blue-eyed boy, who was quite tall for his age. When he was 14 years old, he pitched for the Factoryville team, in an era when a baseball game was easy to find, not just in the big cities, but in small towns and farming communities everywhere all over the country. At the turn of the century, baseball was a pastime for all Americans, not just to watch, but to play. You could be a farmer, a factory worker, a preacher, a school teacher, or just a local kid like Mathewson, and you could play the game with your family, your neighbors, your co-workers, your friends, your community. Teams sprung up everywhere, sponsored by local businesses, colleges, churches, steel mills, factories. Everyday Americans squared off against each other. In addition to working up a sweat, they had fun. And despite living in a still segregated society, all Americans found their way to the game. Baseball brought people together, and in turn fostered pride and competition and fair play within each community. And maybe, just maybe, with some skill and a little luck, you could eventually find your way to the big leagues. In the early 1900s, men from all walks of life descended upon the grass and dirt diamond to seek their fortunes in the wildly popular Traveling Circus that was the dead ball era, when pitching and small ball strategies were king. They came out of mines and factories, off farms and ranches, out of colleges from big cities and small towns, hungry to prove themselves, eager to make good. The carnival-like atmosphere of the early game meant it attracted less than savory personalities, at least according to those from the upper echelon of society. Professional baseball was brawling, thrilling, scrappy, quick, dirty, crafty, violent, and dramatic. This made the presence of a player like Mathewson all the more compelling. A college graduate who spent a lot of time with his nose in a book, he was polite, considerate, orderly. But when he was on the mound, he could blow anyone away and make them look like a fool in the process. John Tortez Myers, also known as Chief Myers, caught nearly every game that Matty pitched for 7 years. "We'd break our necks for that guy," Myers said. If you made an error behind him, he'd never get mad or sulk. He'd come over and pat you on the back. He had the sweetest, most gentle nature. Gentle in every way. He was a great checker player, too. He'd play several men at once. Actually, that's what made him a great pitcher. His wonderful, retentive memory. Anytime you hit a ball hard off him, you never got another pitch in that spot again. Mathewson's clear and unabashed devotion to his religious beliefs, and the quiet and unassuming way in which he went about his business made him a favorite among adults, who encouraged their offspring to seek out a clean-cut hero. In the early 1900s, the country, especially children, looked up to the Christian gentleman. The first baseball cards of the late 1800s and early 1900s were slipped into fragrant packs of chewing and smoking tobacco in order to reach the American working man who followed the game throughout the season. All corners of the tobacco industry embraced the marketing ploy, and cards became synonymous with the products. These cardboard likenesses of baseball heroes, often called cigarette pictures, quickly became sought after by the kids who looked up to the ball players that skillfully played the children's game. Kids would beg, even steal from adults to get their treasured cards. Among the kids themselves, the mania was so strong that fights broke out, and there was even gambling. As the cardboard marketing tool made the transition from tobacco to candy and gum products, the cards themselves evolved with the game that they represented. And ultimately, it was the psychological connection between the ball player and the child that made it all work. At the time, a fan's outlets were few. With no internet, no TV, no radio, there was only the local paper or magazine, or perhaps a fantastical dime store novel. Or, if the child were lucky enough to live in one of the big cities, a chance visit to the rowdy ballpark. Mostly, though, players lived in the fertile and vivid imaginations of their young fans' minds. The life of a child in the early 1900s was not easy. Even those who were more fortunate still learned to live without. A baseball card, then, was a conduit to a hopeful place. Heroes that seemed larger than life, depicted in idyllic surroundings. A place so amazing, so exciting, it seemed more like a dream. And so, we come at last to this card and the world it depicts. The sky is lit up by a setting sun that paints the clouds orange against the sky that is beginning to lose its blue. Mathewson's cheeks are flushed, perhaps from exertion, perhaps from colder weather. And on the horizon, no buildings, no trees, only a green, pristine land that stretches out into infinity. In the image, Matty himself has just released the ball. It's fair to assume he's pitching, but in this field of dreams, perhaps he's simply having a catch with an unknown and equally mythical figure. It hardly matters who it is. The scene is believable and familiar, but it's also surreal and otherworldly and anything but ordinary. So, is this the most beautiful card ever made? These are the kinds of harmless questions we collectors like to pose. They add a little spice to our hobby. They keep the conversations going. Beauty, as they say, is in the eye of the beholder. The truth is, even the ugliest card can be glorious to a collector whose memory elevates it to a special place. But what captures my imagination about this card, beyond its obvious visual beauty, is the motivations behind it, the story of how it came to be, what it represents, the era from which it comes. A time when baseball wasn't so literal, when it was less in our minds and on our screens, and more in our hearts. This card feels like baseball, at least the baseball we'd like to believe existed at one time, and one that we'd like to return to when things have gotten too calculated, too rote, too mechanical. This images baseball as we'd like it to be at least part of the time. It reminds us not only of the early days of the game itself and of one of its greatest players, but of our own early days, playing on local fields and in backyards when it was all for the joy and for the love. You can see all of that and more if you look long enough. So, question for you. What's a pre-war card that you think captures an idealized pastoral version of baseball? Leave it in the comments. Would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for checking out the video, and if you enjoyed this journey, check out more from the series. You'll find a link in the description below. I hope you'll join me for another cup of coffee in the future. Until then, take care, and I'll talk to you all soon.